associate professor at the University of Foggia. I'm also part-time at the European University Institute. And my research focused primarily on agriculture and trade policy, with emphasis on understanding effects on global markets and developments. I've also served as chair of the International Agricultural Trade Research Consortium. And I'm very delighted today to have this webinar with a terrific panel of speakers. So today we're going to discuss about agricultural trade regime, and in particular, this is very timely and relevant, given the strategic dialogue on the future of EU agriculture that has clearly emphasized the importance of promoting a sustainable and competitive trade regime. So clearly, this webinar aims to highlight the critical importance of sustainable agricultural trade, the benefit for the environment, society, and the economy. So I want to remember everyone that this is going to be recorded and is also streaming in on the YouTube channel of the Florence School of Regulation. As I said before, I'm very delighted to have a terrific panel of speakers. So we have Flavio Coturni from DigiTrade. Hi, Flavio. Rob Voss from International Food Policy Research Institute. Hi, Rob. Susan Stone from the University of South Australia. Hello, Susan. Yuka Likitalo from EUCOLATE. Hi, Yuka. And last but not least, Ignacio Sanchez Recarte from CEEV. Hello, Ignacio. So before we hear from the speakers, let me give a few words on the rationale of this webinar and what's going on in terms of sustainability of trade regime and all of that. So, and before even introduce me, I want to say that we are going to have all the speakers speaking after me, and we have a Q&A box where you can place your questions, and we will read them and pass them to the speakers. So I want to start saying that clearly the global agricultural sector is increasingly challenged by climate change, biodiversity loss, and soil degradation. And this has clearly led to geopolitical and geoeconomic disruption. Now, the COVID pandemic and Russia's war in Ukraine has further destabilized the food and commodity flows, highlighting the fragility of the system and underscoring the need for a resilient and sustainable agricultural trade regime. In response to that, the European Union is taking a leadership role in shaping a global trade policy framework to promote sustainability of the agri-food systems. This span from the challenges in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emission, have a better use of water use, or ensuring biodiversity. So this framework clearly established clear objectives and guidelines principles that are important for trade and to create a level playing field. Central to this approach is the alignment of EU trade policies with high sustainability standards, balancing the ambition of the European Union to lead on sustainability, while also the need of gaining global recognition. This strategy also aims to maintain the EU's competitive edge as both a leading agricultural exporter and also an attractive marketer for global suppliers. And of course, trade regime has to comply with the WTO rules such as non-discrimination, reciprocity, and transparency. Now, the European Union has strategically integrated sustainability into trade policies to promote resilient and responsible food systems. This approach is reflecting a combination of trade and sustainable development chapters in trade agreements, unilateral measures such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the regulation on deforestation-free products, as well as on directives like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, all of which together are useful to ensure that EU is leading a sustainable global agenda. So important element of this are the trade agreements. So those are clearly a cornerstone of the EU strategy to integrate sustainability into global trade. Since the landmark of EU-South Korea Free Trade Agreement in 2009, EU has used its influence to embed sustainability into objectives of the trade agreements. And now they are included in the trade and sustainable development chapters. This chapter address environmental protection, labor rights, and climate change, and have evolved to include commitments on issues like illegal logging and sustainable forest management. Recently, agreements with countries like New Zealand and China, as well as ongoing negotiations with India, Indonesia, and Australia, have introduced chapters on sustainable food systems, reflecting the importance that EU trade policy is putting on sustainable agriculture. However, this is not exempt by challenges. So in fact, the effectiveness of those chapters is often limited by a lack of enforceable consequence for non-compliance. To address this, the European Commission has proposed elevating the Paris Agreement to a status of an essential element in trade agreements. This would allow for the suspension of agreements or the imposition of trade sanctions if parties fail to comply with their obligation under the Paris Agreement. And this is a clear signal of the strong commitment in ensuring a sustainable agenda. The global agricultural sector is also very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, while it's also contributed to global greenhouse gas emissions. It is estimated the agriculture is approximately accounting for a quarter of total anthropogenic emissions. And to lower the impact of agriculture on emission, a key tool is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, among others. CBAM will align carbon price of imported goods with that of domestic production. And the mechanism is designed to support EU's climate goals while encouraging cleaner industries practices in non-EU countries. So clearly, CBAM is an important element of the sustainable agricultural trade regime, as it covers fertilizers that are key input in upstream agri-food productions. The gradual implementation of CBAM that will be effective in 2026 will be coordinated with the EU emission trading schemes, and this is going to facilitate the decarbonization of industries, emitting industries like the fertilizers one. Further examples are the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which came into play into 2023. And this is strengthening the corporate reporting on social and environmental sustainability. The directive has a critical role in promoting sustainability and resilience within the agri-food supply chains. So it requires reporting on environmental impact, and on this encourages farmers and agri-food businesses to monitor and mitigate their contribution to climate change. Further, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that is effective since this year, mandates that companies addresses adverse human rights and environmental impacts across their value chains. This is very important because forced labor is clearly a problem in the agricultural sector, as in other sectors as well. So the directive has the potential to bring benefits to smallholder farmers through protection of human rights and more equal relationship based on collaboration, shared responsibility, and fair purchasing practices. In addition to those measures, the EU regulation on deforestation-free products is another critical component of the sustainability agenda. The regulation targets the link between deforestation and agricultural trade and aims to significantly reduce the contribution of EU to global deforestation. In practice, it aimed to cut deforestation-related carbon emission by at least 32 million metric tons annually imposing due diligence obligation on certain commodities like cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil. So by December 2025, the operators will be required to demonstrate that their products do not originate from recently deforested areas or areas that have contributed to forest degradation. The regulation includes a benchmark categorizing nations in low, standards, or high risk. And very recently, the Parliament has included another category of no-risk nations for those nations where there is a stable growth of forested area. However, those directive measures and unilateral actions are not exempt from challenges. For instance, for the UDR, a particular risk is due to potential leakage, where deforestation-linked commodities may divert trade to market with less stringent regulation. And this could disproportionately affect smallholder farmers, particularly in countries where smallholder farmers are very important. Just to give an example, Brazil and Tanzania, where I would say that we have smallholder farmers accounting for more than 50% of the production of some crops like cocoa, palm oil, and coffee for Brazil. And even larger, the share is for Tanzania, where smallholder shares accounts to about 90% for coffee, palm oil, and cocoa. So the effects are very important, and what it should be suggested is more research and dialogue to understand the effects of those measures when they will actually be enforced. So I want to start closing this saying that the approach of the EU on sustainable agricultural trade is clearly ambitious, is multifaceted. And through a combination of regulatory tools, trade agreements, and sustainability-driven policies, it's clear that the EU aims to lead the global transition to a more equitable, environmentally conscious agriculture system. At the same time, it should balance the environmental objectives with the practical realities of the global supply chain and the economic, socioeconomic condition of smallholder farmers. So the EU comprehensive approach to sustainable agricultural trade is critical to address the challenges of climate change, deforestation, food security, and is also important to ensure the resilience of the global supply chain. I'll stop here while we will hear from very good speakers today. So while we continue navigating this, I'll be pleased to hear from our next speakers that are going to provide further insights on the role of trade agreements, directives, policy, sustainability policies. And last but not least, we'll also hear from businesses what is the role of businesses and how they are actually facing this evolving regime. Before I conclude, let me introduce Alessia Casamassima, that is going to serve as a terrific moderator for this webinar. Alessia from FSR Climate, welcome, and you're free to introduce the next speakers. Thank you, Alessia.
Thank you, Fabio. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alessia Casamassima. I'm a research associate from FSR in the climate area, and I will be the moderator of the webinar. So the first speaker is Flavio Coturni. So it's a huge pleasure to have Flavio with us. So he started his career in the European Commission in the cereals and rice market units in DG Agri. And before, he was appointed head of the unit Agricultural Trade Policy Analysis. And now he is head of the unit Agriculture, Food and Sanitary and Phytosanitary Matters in DG Trade. So its unit major tasks are to ensure the consistency of EU trade policy with the Europeans' international obligation. So he is well suited to offer valuable insight into how the European strategy for a sustainable agricultural trade regime is developing. So, Flavio, if you agree, we can start from this point. So, how is the European strategy for a sustainable agricultural trade regime evolving?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Alessia. Thank you, Fabio, for inviting me to this important event. The subjects we are discussing today are indeed extremely relevant, especially in the last 5 years. But having said that, there is a story behind, of course, the relationship between trade policy and sustainability policy in the EU, which dates back to 15, 20 years ago. And recently, in the last 5 years, because of the priority that the Green Deal has taken in the last Commission, these topics have been top of the agenda of the Commission policy areas in the field of trade and sustainability. In particular, these questions have raised to maximum level of attention recently in Europe due to the difficulties through which the farming community is navigating, which manifests itself through a number of protests in the streets, etc., and which tells us and reminds us of how difficult it is to design, develop, and present a policy like the trade policy, which is to be consistent with other areas of and other policy areas in the EU, such as the sustainability elements. So we are in a very difficult moment right now. We're discussing certain issues related, for example, to the Mercosur agreement, which are directly relevant for the discussions we are having today, and it's basically daily news that where we look and see how these topics are being dealt with in several countries in the EU, particularly in France, but also elsewhere. So this is just to say how difficult and challenging is the role of policymakers actually to design policies which are coherent and consistent, and also to present these policies to the wider public and to have a precise and correct and accurate perception of where we're going. Fabio, you have been very exhaustive and comprehensive in your presentation of how EU policies have developed over time, including the very last development on the deforestation regulation, which took place in the context of the discussion within the European Parliament. I would say that I would add to that definitely we have been making efforts as European policymakers or designers at different level. I should mention also the multilateral level, because you mentioned definitely the unilateral and bilateral dimension of trade policy and sustainability. I will come back to that, but I would also add the multilateral dimension, which is extremely important. This is a dimension which is sometimes not forgotten, but so to say, put aside in the context of this debate, because for obvious reasons, because this is the area which, in terms of efforts and in terms of results, is the one which takes a long time to develop its results. And so it's a long-term policy, and nobody's expecting from a multilateral level to have solutions to the relationship between trade and sustainability in the short term. And I refer in particular, for example, to the efforts we are making together with other partners in the world in the context of standard setting bodies, where this is an extremely important work, because there is nothing better than defining together by means of cooperation and collaboration with other trade partners the type of standards we think are necessary to enhance trade and to make sure also that consumers trust the product they consume. So the work we're doing in the context of the World Health Organization, but also in the context of the World Animal Health Organization, but also in the IPPC, so in the Plant Protection Product discussions we're having with other countries. These are all extremely important because once you set standards at multilateral level, this is clearly a trade enhancing and trade facilitating element, which reduces the potential for discussions and possibly also controversies between countries. Our work in the WTO should also be mentioned. The WTO and environment has developed some areas of cooperation and collaboration. We try, so to say, to streamline environmental and climate change issues in the context of the WTO by means of working within the Trade and Environmental Committee in the WTO. We also have an alliance of trade ministers in favor of reducing climate change, and this is at political level. We're trying to also develop multilateral initiatives within the WTO in matters such as plastics and others, where we try to make sure that this multilateral element is present and it's an enabler to create a basic cooperation on matters of sustainability, in particular in the agri-food sector. When it comes to the bilateral and unilateral side, we, as you pointed out, Fabio, we have a number of chapters in our free trade agreements, the trade and sustainable development chapters, and a chapter on food sustainable systems. And the first one, we have a number of commitments which go together with the market access commitments, which are typical and traditional in an FTA. So beyond these market access commitments, we try to reach a consensus on a number of binding commitments in relation to areas such as, for example, environment and multilateral conventions on environment, but also on the ILO conventions in terms of labor law. And wherever we feel there are gaps in the implementation or even in the designing of these policies within a given third country, then we use the platform on FTA to make sure that these policy areas are well integrated into the legal system or the partner with which we negotiate before we conclude the agreement. That's a very important element which builds trust around sustainability elements on trade with this third country. And as you pointed out, Fabio, recently this has been enhanced and topped up by a number of commitments which have been shown, for example, in the latest New Zealand agreement, where we have stepped up the commitments to integrate the Paris Agreement binding commitments as essential elements, which may lead to sanctions and withdrawal of the agreement as a last resort. So there was a very special call from our civil society, but also from the political level, to step up the type and quality of commitments on sustainability. I think what we've done with the New Zealand is a clear evidence that this is feasible. Although we should not shy away from the fact that, of course, one thing is, of course, to negotiate with a like-minded, I would call it like-minded country like New Zealand, and a totally different way is, of course, with other countries which are from which the distance in terms of sustainability elements is wider. But that's a fact. It's an important element. Now, on the unilateral level, definitely all the things you have mentioned, deforestation, CBAM, etc., are very wide and far-reaching unilateral regulatory elements that we would like to extend and create a kind of virtuous circle whereby also we would drag other countries in the world to align to this type of ambitious commitments. It's not easy to implement, as the discussion on the deforestation has shown, in particular with the need to delay the implementation. But we definitely think that we are on the right track if we want to address these global concerns. And we have made a lot of efforts in terms of cooperation with third countries to avoid the accusation that we are trying to colonialize the world with our own regulatory system. Sometimes we have been accused of green protectionism or green colonialism. We have spent a lot of time worldwide in all different fora, multilateral level, bilateral level, and in all sorts of contacts with third countries to try to explain why this is a joint and common interest to go down this path. Specifically on agri-food matters, we have had a number of unilateral also initiatives whereby we made sure that certain standards on environment and are also applicable to imported products, but we have been doing so on a case-by-case basis, very carefully designing these measures in light of the WTO obligations we have, in particular non-discrimination, etc. So we have taken a very prudent approach in applying this unilateral measure. We've always looked at WTO angle to make sure that they are consistent. But nevertheless, there is a discussion ongoing with the countries, of course, and it would require further efforts to make sure that to spell out the criticism that we're trying to colonialize the world with our own rules and trying to make sure that people, around the world really share our common view that we need to be facing these challenges with very effective measures, and we hope to do this together with the countries. I would stop there, and of course, if there are questions, then I would be more than happy to reply in a more specific way. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavio. So it was absolutely interesting, and actually, I have a question. So because you mentioned a bunch of issues to address, and I want to focus also so the attention on the key challenge and opportunities that should be addressed. So my question specifically is, what are the key challenges that must be addressed and the urgent opportunities that need to be taken?
Yes, on the key elements, I think now we, as you know, we are at which the commission is changing. We have a number of commissioner designates which are undergoing the hearings in front of the European Parliament, and we expect that the new commission would soon come in place, and it will take the role. So we are in a situation where, from a policy point of view, we are at the beginning of a new commission where certain policy objectives will be defined very shortly. So on the one hand, this prevents me from going too far into defining what are the key priorities that you will very soon see as coming out from the new commission. At the same time, it's fairly easy to say that all the current legislation which has been put forward will not be withdrawn. So we will continue to go ahead on issues like deforestation, CBAM, due diligence, etc. And these things have been put on the table. Some of these are already in place and in force. It's a matter of implementation. And so if I could say the agenda which was set down during the Green Deal, etc., and the path which has already been adopted will continue to be developed, and it's a question of implementing it in a proper way. Will there be new initiatives? I cannot tell. It's quite the agenda is quite charged by these initiatives. So difficult to say whether there will be something on top, because it's already, we will need to digest what we have and to make it possible. On the other hand, certainly we are also confronted in the agri-food sector with a number of critical views from the farming community in the EU, which, for example, look at the Mercosur agreement with lots of skepticism. And here the sustainability elements do play an important role. Currently, we are about to finish or renegotiate the agreement to try to enhance the sustainability elements of the Mercosur agreement. without reopening the agricultural chapter, which was concluded in 2019. And we hope that we'll be doing that in the next weeks in a way to overcome the criticism and make sure that people also in the farming community in Europe understand the value added that this agreement would bring, not only in terms of market access, but also in terms of sustainability.
Okay, perfect, Flavio. So we can go to the second speaker, Rob Voss, from the International Food Policy Research Institute. So Rob is a senior research fellow in the Markets, Trade and Institution Unit, and previously led the Markets, Trade and Institution Division, beginning in 2017. He was also director of agricultural development economics at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, responsible for economic analysis and policy support for sustainable agricultural development and food security. He is also an academic covering a broad range of development issues such as trade policy, inequality, and poverty. So, Rob, I think it would be interesting to hear your opinion on how the global strategy for a sustainable agricultural trade regime is evolving, and what is the role of Europe in such development.
Thank you very much, Celestia, and thanks for this invitation, this opportunity to speak at what I think is a very important event. Since, well, it's already been mentioned, climate change is projected to reduce agricultural productivity. With it, we should expect more volatility in crop and livestock production. And we may also expect significant regional shifts in agricultural production with more intense climate change. So within that, trade can play an important role. It could, for sure, as it's already doing, help for countries obtain nutritious foods at the lowest possible cost, stabilize their food supplies against volatile market conditions, but also it can help promote more efficient use of natural resources and through that also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The question, though, is that's not a trend that we're seeing. We see growing trade, but we also see growing greenhouse gas emissions. So the question is, how can we conduct mitigation adaptation policies to combat climate change in ways that would also be consistent with our international trade regime? So before I get to some of the solutions that we could think of, it's important to realize some trends we see in global food trade. It's been growing very fast over the past 50 years or so. But one important aspect that often is forgotten, that is an increasing share of food trade is in the form of processed foods. It's now about 1/4 of agri-food trade is in processed foods, whereas previously it was mainly unprocessed food. So if we think of climate change and food systems, we should not just look at the link with agriculture policies, but also look beyond the farm. The second aspect from global trends that we see is already mentioned. We see still growing emissions from food systems, now counting about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions for the food system at large. Agricultural production as a source of emissions is gradually falling in terms of its share, but that of things happening beyond the farm is growing and is now becoming an increasingly important component. So again, also there, we cannot just think about these issues just looking at what happens in agriculture at the farm level, but to the entire food system at large. The last caveat from the trends that we see, important also for deciding on which policy instruments work well, don't work well, is to realize that emissions from agri-food systems come from highly decentralized processes from very different sources, be it nitrate emissions from inputs to methane from rice production or livestock production and different sources, that makes it certain policy instruments more difficult to implement. I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's important to realize these aspects when we think through the solutions. But certainly to come to in terms of your question, so we're not really moving in the right direction. So we see growing food trade, but also still growing emissions from food systems. So climate policies will be important to redress this. I have a couple of do's, 4 of them, and 2 don'ts or measures with some buts, and I'll conclude with those. So first, of course, free and open trade should be integral to any climate smart agriculture and food policy for the reasons I mentioned, but they won't come by themselves, as we've seen. And we've also seen recent trends and forthcoming even more trends of more protective policies that would run counter this principle, but also run counter the principles of the international trading regime. So when we think about aligning climate policies for food systems with international trading rules, as to make sure that things can happen at a level playing field, the first thing is to think about measures that are effective but are least distorting to markets and trade. And one of them, I'm not saying this just because I'm part of a large research organization, but investing in research and development for climate smart and productivity enhancing and emission reducing technologies is one critical element and step forward. And there's many technologies that in agriculture and food system that are on tap, but to bring them on tap, they will have to be tailored and adapted to local conditions. And also, many farmers will need the right kind of incentives to adopt those. And so, with that, I think it's very important to link this to existing farm policies, as many of the existing farm policies around the world, just pointing at the EU, not necessarily are supporting sustainable production methods, but actually the existing production methods and types of production that are still highly intensive in emissions. So that would be one, and that to link that to repurpose or reorient the existing domestic support with trade measures to provide the right incentives for adoption of climate smart agricultural practices that are also productivity enhancing will be critical. The first do would be, and what can help, and that the European Union is also doing that, is to work with farm payments for eco services. That could be also linked to the adoption of these better practices. That would work well also with trading rules, if as long as they're decoupled from output and input use, so that they won't work as market distorting measures. The key thing there, and it's also the way things work out in the case of the European Union support for incentives to reduce use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, for instance, is to try and avoid the risk that will lead to lower productivity practices. Because if you do that, then lower agricultural production could lead not necessarily within the European Union, but could provide incentives elsewhere to increase production and clear land for agricultural production, and through that enhance emissions. So that's one do with a but.
We have less than 1 minute.
I'll conclude with 2 more observations. First, sustainability quality standards for foods are very important. The qualifications there are that those standards should be science-based, but most of all, if we do that, we should be able to work with harmonized standards, otherwise we may end up with a spaghetti bowl of measures. Last but not least, two don'ts that relates to something was mentioned before. First, carbon taxes in agri-food systems are much more complex than in the energy sector for the reasons I explained before, because decentralized nature of the generation of emissions and the production processes is such that there can be first high leakage from carbon taxes if done by individual countries, like Denmark's recent decision to tax livestock production. But also one would have then to cautiously monitor emissions across farmers, but also farmers may adapt and adopt different practices leading to different amounts of emissions. So very difficult to implement. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, and I'll end with that, also has complications. First, it can violate the WTO national equal treatment principles if foreign and domestic producers would be treated differently. That could be modified if one uses the CBAM to impose equal levies on domestic production and imports, and then rebate the carbon tax on exports, like we do with VAT export rebates. And that then could shift the export, or sort of the tax base for the carbon tax from output to consumption and to input use, and through that stimulate more sustainable production practices. But again, also here, that would require agreement on common standards, for instance, on the emission coefficients based on production practices, and that's not going to be easy. So there are solutions that come with complications, but we have to very carefully think through these measures, given the nature of trade that is changing, and given the complex composition of emissions and climate impacts of agriculture production. Let me stop here. Thank you. Back to you, Alessia.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So I would go ahead with the next speaker, Susan Stone. So Susan is the Credit Union South Australia Chair of Economics at the University of South Australia. Prior to joining the university, she was a division head of the OECD, a director for the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, a senior research fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo, and a research manager at the Productivity Commission in Melbourne. So, Susan, how is the global strategy for a sustainable agricultural trade regime evolving, and what role is the Europe playing in this development?
Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks for having me. I thought I would concentrate a little bit more on what's going on in Australia. So some of the global trends that are playing out there, because obviously Australia is a big agricultural trading nation. About more than 70% of our output is exported. So it's a key sector and a key activity for the Australian economy, especially on the global stage. And Rob had mentioned the increasing toll that climate is going to take on productivity and agricultural activities. And actually, this has already been playing out in Australia. ABARES have done some estimates where climate-related losses in terms of productivity and profitability have cost Australian farmers more than 1.1 billion Australian dollars a year for the past 20 years. And they've also estimated that the average productivity for broadacre crops has declined about 23%. So there is a real appreciation for this need to increase output without increase in emissions, so a decoupling from production and emissions. And there's been a move to focus on output-based measures. So Australia, in this sense, has been doing quite well. the average output increase in agriculture has been over 100% between 1970 and 2020, while land use has actually declined by 28%. So we've been able to increase our output while actually using less land. Land clearing in 2021 was 75% below what the levels were in 2000. And over 80% of Australian crops are produced using zero or no tillage to try to minimize land disruption. So Australia is moving much more into this, trying to use less inputs to try to do it in a more sustainable manner. About twice the amount of land has been put into conservation in Australia than many of our peers in this area. So I would say a globing, evolving strategy from our perspective is to, have these larger global goals and policy frameworks, but to allow a difference in terms of adaptation and how we get there based on place, based on the unique structure of individual countries, especially a country like Australia that has very different environment across the different areas and also across the globe. One of the other things that we talk about in terms of a global strategy that we would like to see more of is talking about support, agricultural support. There's agricultural markets continue to be some of the most distorted markets globally, with average tariffs about 75% above average industrial tariffs. There's been estimates from the OECD that there's been over $600 billion that's spent on support. And it's estimated that more than half of that is really damaging and leading to environmental outcomes that are worse or than need be with those distortion measures. So the idea would be if we could take some of that market support, especially in terms of price support, input support, and move it into more mitigating and other types of activities that would help enhance sustainability, that this would really help move that global strategy forward and allow for us to have, better outcomes in agriculture going forward. So I'm just going to leave it there for now.
Thank you, Susan. So let's go to the other speaker. We have Ignacio Sanchez Recarte from CEV. So Ignacio joined the CEV as a Secretary General in June 2015. So the CEV is the association representing 7,000 European wine companies in the industry and trade of all wine categories. So it is also closely connected to other wine and agri-food related bodies at European and global level. And it's a member of the European Liaison Committee for Agricultural and Agri-Food Trade, the Wine in the Moderation Program, and the International Federation on Wine and Spirits. So Ignacio, how are companies positioning themselves in response to the European strategy for promoting a sustainable agricultural trade regime?
Thank you, Alessia. I think, first of all, if we want to think about what is sustainable wine production, one of the elements that will show that we are sustainable is the permanence of this cellar and vineyard along the time. Because we produce under PDO PGIs more than 65% of our wines, we are hooked to a place. And if you look at the history of our wine companies, you will see that many of them has been there for many generations. But for me, it's a clear indication that you are sustainable from the bottom line, the triple bottom line, from an economic point of view, because you have been able to maintain your company, your business, from a social point of view, because you need a lot of people. It's an intense labor working sector, in the territory, and there is data that demonstrate that where wine is present, it maintains population in rural areas. And from the third element, which is the environment. As I was saying, we depend on a vineyard. We cannot go into the global market to buy grapes to produce our wine, so we are hooked to a territory. So all the European Union package to work for sustainability, for us is music to our ears. We have been working on it. It is good that is better structured, that it tries to harmonize, because one of the elements that we have been seeing in the past is the unharmonized interpretation of what is sustainability. And when we are trading with different retailers, we are facing different requests from retailers. Just to put an example, from Northern Europe monopolies, they were asking for a certification that our vineyards were sustainable from a social point of view. That's European Union law. You cannot have slaves or children in your vineyard working, or in any factory. So we support the approach of the European Commission, which is putting some light on the question of what is sustainable, which is first to be asked how to fight greenwashing and how to fight non-sustainable practices. And we need to go in that direction. So the package looks good to us. The objective looks good to us. We have a certain fear. We are a sector that today, to be sustainable in the long term, we need international trade. And that's a critical point, is how sustainability in the wine sector is interpreted. And here we welcome the approach that the European Commission has had, for example, with the United States, where with the establishment of the collaborative platform on agriculture, where it's a positive forum in which we exchange on visions of how we produce, how we interpret sustainability in the wine sector. Because as you could understand, a vineyard or a cellar in the south of Sicily is facing completely different challenge that a winery in the Rhine area in the Palatina region in Germany. And the same way, our concept of sustainability or our path towards a bigger sustainability in Europe may be slightly different from the one that our colleagues in California or in Chile are taking, because the challenges are a little bit different, or maybe the paths of the journeys to reach the full sustainability is a little bit different. So 100% supportive of the approach of the Commission. And I think the Commission understood very well that they cannot go in a completely 100% unilateral interpretation of what sustainability, and they need to work on an understanding of how the others are producing, and also an explanation of why we are producing like this in Europe and why the Commission is jumping to the next level of sustainability. If we look at how companies are facing this challenge, they have been doing the work for the last years. We have a problem with certifications, the cost of certifications, and just to put in a parenthesis, 99% of our companies, more than 99% of our companies are micro, small, and medium-sized companies. So you cannot go to a small company and request them a certain certification, and then when you trade with a different retailer or in another country, they request you another certification scheme. Every certification scheme costs a lot of money. It's administrative paperwork. So what we ask is the ultimate request of support from the Commission is to work on an umbrella interpretation of what is sustainable grape and wine production, so that any certification that falls below or under this umbrella could be considered as sustainable, so out of greenwashing principles, and are recognizable by international partners and retailers, so that we can simplify. So the final point is cost of certification. We will need some extra support. The wine sector, because the place where we have the vineyards is at the forefront of the fight of climate change, our plant, you can imagine south of Italy or certain parts of Portugal, they are suffering a lot of the climate change, and our capacity of adaptation, moving from one region to another, is limited. So we absolutely need the Commission to coordinate the response and the support in the implementation of best available practices in the vineyard. We need certainly to continue to make evolve the common agricultural policy, so that the efforts of support of the European Commission is there to anticipate the future. If we wait too much and we do business as usual, in 5-10 years time, we will be just with a limited capacity to maintain our sustainability.
Okay, thank you, Ignacio. So then we can go to the last speakers, Jukka Likitalo from Eucolate. So Jukka is the Secretary General of Eucolate, which has been involved in the European derived business community since 1959. It has more than 100,000 employees and provide policy analysis, market information, and customer advice to members from 21 countries. So Jukka, we would like to know your opinion on how companies are positioning themselves with respect to the European strategies.
Thank you very much, Alessia, and thank you for the introduction. I wish we had so many employees, but I think the number you gave was more for the whole dairy sector represented in our membership. But we would certainly welcome the help in our office as well. So I would briefly start by saying that the dairy sector, which I represent, is quite specific and complex by nature. In that we have one very nutritious raw material, that is milk, which is then processed into a stunning variety of products and ingredients. You have cheese, butter, different milk and whey powders, protein concentrates, of course the liquid products as well, milk and cream. And these products all have very diverse applications and outlets, ranging from retail to food service and ingredients used for the food industry. And we really need trade to bridge the supply and demand for all of these. So picking up a little bit what was said by the previous speakers, I think it's very easy to agree on the overall objective. We all want agri-food trade to be as sustainable as possible. Now, what exactly do we mean by that? Is it food and nutrition security for all, a fair remuneration of farmers, good working conditions for everyone in the supply chain, avoiding unfair competition and any adverse effects on the environment? Probably all of this and more. But my point here is that while the economic, environmental, and social pillars can and should reinforce each other, there are sometimes trade-offs to be made as well, as I believe was mentioned by Flavio during his introduction, that it's not always easy to find a policy, or it's never easy to find a policy that can deliver, positive outcomes on all those fronts. But I do firmly believe that trade is quite essential for the sustainability of food systems. First, from a global food security perspective, because trade complements local food systems, moving products from surplus to deficit areas. In Europe, we have a highly dynamic single market doing that. And in addition, of course, we are exporting, in the dairy sector, we are exporting about 20% of our production in the form of different dairy products. Second, on the environmental front, because trade, if it is accompanied by responsible production in areas with the lowest emissions, can help to significantly reduce the carbon footprint of our sector globally. So it's really about using resources as effectively as possible. And I think that the role of trade in climate mitigation will become more important looking forward as global demand for dairy continues to increase, mainly in regions that are not so well suited for milk production because of hot and humid climates or lack of water. And finally, the third aspect is that trade creates employment across the whole supply chain, food industry, retail, food service, export, import, and also contributes to the viability of rural areas. Now, the question was specifically about how companies are positioning themselves. I think they look at their reputation and their license to operate. And this is also why sustainability efforts of European dairy companies predate the Green Deal. So if we take climate action as an example, the European dairy industry already has one of the lowest carbon footprints globally, and many companies have committed to further serious emission reductions and even climate neutrality by a certain date. I think this sort of push for greater sustainability is probably more market and society driven than it is policy driven, because having very solid sustainability credentials is really necessary these days from a reputational perspective, because customers, employees, and consumers all expect that operators do business in an environmentally and socially responsible manner. So I would say that sustainability is increasingly part of sort of company culture to different degrees, of course. So while many businesses are embracing this opportunity, if we can call it that, it does not mean that they all agree with everything in the EU's agri-food trade regime and strategy, which is being shaped as we speak, because we are, of course, right in between two legislative cycles. So there are maybe two issues I would quickly like to mention in this context. First, it has already been covered by others as well. We are seeing that the EU is adopting more and more unilateral measures, which are targeting imports, deforestation regulation being one example. So while no one can really argue with the objective, I think it's really important that this kind of instruments are designed in a way that they are, first of all, implementable in practice with reasonable administrative burden. And secondly, they should not lead to retaliation by our trading partners, which in turn target our exports. Because if you end up having a trade war, it's not a very sustainable outcome either. The second topic I wanted to mention here is that sustainability requirements, as was mentioned, are also now an inherent part of our free trade agreements. And of course, we agree that it's important to try to promote European standards insofar as possible, primarily through the WTO and other multilateral organizations. But I think what we cannot do is kind of imposing our standards on the rest of the world, because other countries have different values, different resources and priorities, and they may simply not be able to comply with all of Europe's demands. So I think if we take a too hard stance here, it means that you end up not being able to conclude agreements, which then might lead to a worse outcome from a sustainability perspective, taking Mercosur or Indonesia as an example here. So I think overall the EU should perhaps regulate a little bit less and do more to support European companies in the green transition by stimulating innovation and entrepreneurship. So in summary, a bit more carrot and less stick would be our message. And of course, we also believe that the EU must remain a champion in promoting open and rule-based trade. So we do need that further diversification of market access opportunities, which is essential for the resilience of our supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alessia, I think I should open the debate, isn't it the case?
Yes, I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience.
Yeah, clearly, I mean, first, thanks, everyone. I mean, we have a very diverse set of perspectives, and I'm learning myself a lot. I believe that also speakers, attendees are learning also and are curious. So let me read some questions and maybe we can open the debate. And there are questions that are specifically directed to a speaker, but if any one of you is interested in giving his perspective, that's absolutely good. So I would say there is a first question that is asking for the compliance with WTO rule as a problem for EU sustainable agricultural trade policy. But let me couple this with another question, because I think this may have actually an easy answer. There's a question for DG Trade. Could you provide examples of successful sustainable agricultural policies which have been implemented in third countries as a result of FTA or unilateral EU measures? I will just stay with those two. I don't know if we can answer those couple of questions.
Okay, so the first one is WTO compliances and the other one is on success stories, right? So let's take the first one. I say it with a little bit of pride. Well, the European Commission, the European Union is a key member of the WTO and an active member which strives to keep the WTO not only alive, but the multilateral forum which develops a way of cooperation, negotiation, but also dispute settlement. So in a word, a rule-based system. We see the WTO as the key forum for a rule-based system where actually not only rules are developed and implemented, but also where rules are enforced to the extent this is possible. So, I mean, our history it shows that we are one of the driving forces behind the WTO. We support the WTO process. We always are and will be a WTO member with an active role in there, and this will not change in the next commission. So when designing a policy, we take great care in making sure that the policy and the regulations are consistent with WTO rules. This is something which is done in a consistent way, systematically, and there is absolutely no regulation or regulatory act which comes out of the Commission, proposed by the Commission and eventually approved by the co-legislators, if it's a basic act which is not assessed and for which we're not absolutely sure that it's consistent with a WTO rule. So this is also the case for the deforestation regulation, CBAM, etc. So we're pretty confident that the things that we have proposed in terms of legislation are very solid and sound from an international rules-based point of view. Now, on the second question, if I correctly understood, is give a few examples of policies that the EU has successfully influenced or successfully negotiated or discussed or introduced in a third country through an FTA, for example. We have areas, for example, where animal welfare, for example, issues like antimicrobial treatment, which are a general concern for all countries in the world, and by means of cooperation in the context of the platforms that have been created in the FTAs, we have platforms of cooperation whereby we discuss these issues with the third country in question, and we do succeed in making sure that these issues are actually, which are common challenges with the rest of the world. These are not challenges only for the EU. These are challenges for the whole humankind, and these are global concerns. We have seen successes in the uptake of these policies also in third countries which had a less developed legislation in this field. Of course, this requires cooperation. It's not something which you get it in the short term, in a matter of months or a couple of years, but it's definitely something which is very powerful. Sometimes it's even more powerful than any possible unilateral measures that we may take. Voilà. That I would stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think there are couple of questions that are in the Q&A that I would direct to Rob and Susan. And in particular, it has been asked if combating the food waste is part of the agenda for sustainable agriculture. And I would link this to the fight to lower the use of inputs that Susan has pointed. So I think this is very much related to what Rob and Susan were saying, and how you see reducing inputs and reducing waste playing a crucial role in the sustainable agenda globally.
If I start, but the answer, yes, they should. Starting with food loss and waste. So according to all available evidence we have, it's difficult to measure it along all the food value chains, but roughly 1/3 of all foods being produced gets and that is meant for human consumption, gets either lost in the production process on farm or in post-harvest handling, or at the consumer level, and then we call it food waste. So yeah, we have good ways to reduce food waste, and certainly if all things being equal, we can reduce food waste by 1/3, and all the production that goes into it would no longer be needed, right? So we will get more efficiency in the food system consequently. The tougher part is that both in rich and poor countries, the share of food waste is much bigger. So things happen at the consumer level, and that's a lot more difficult to contrast. It requires both changes in the way food is being delivered and preserved before it gets to the consumer, but also requires behavioral changes by consumers themselves. We probably all know that we may buy a lot more food than we actually consume and then throw it away if it's no longer past the days. And also there's some trade-offs to take care of, because you can preserve better foods by packaging it better. That could have issues with use of plastics and other inputs, or use of energy if we put it too long in refrigeration. So those are things to consider, but certainly there's enormous gains to be had, both in developing and in developed countries from combating food waste. But I see it as part of a broader agenda of improving the efficiency of food value chains more in general. So I think that's one part of the question. I forgot the second part. What's the other side?
Thank you, Rob. I think we may hear from Susan. It was really related on her speech on inputs. I mean, how you see reducing inputs being a crucial or a minor part of the sustainable agenda? If you have like a 1 minute to reply to this burning question.
Yeah, I can say that Australia has been focusing a lot on land use reduction and taking land out into conservation and things like that, but has been reaching a bit of diminishing returns on that lately, where we've been focusing more recently as livestock becomes a larger and larger part of the agricultural mix in Australia. We've been looking at reducing an output of livestock, and that's methane. So there's about a program that the federal government has just put in place, about $40 million in R&D to look at feedstocks and to particularly one aspect is seaweed and some other types of mixes that can go to feed livestock, which would hopefully lead to major reductions in methane. So from that perspective, it's not just a reduction in the total amount of inputs, but in the types of inputs as well.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions that I would kindly address to Jukka and Ignacio with a very, very brief reply, I mean, given their perspective, and then if I may ask a closing remark from Flavio. So the questions that I would like to direct to Ignacio and Jukka is basically, attendees have asked if lack of societal support or clarity and feasibility, so lack of clarity or feasibility, and also political instability have had, in your view, a role in failure of agreements, directives. So what is your perspective from the business point of view? And, you know, what do you think about these questions? Ignacio, you go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So as Jukka has said, we need trade to be sustainable, and we need a sustainable trade. All kinds of disputes are putting at risk trade, the image of trade, which is seen as something negative for the planet, which is not the case. It's fundamental to maintain our rural areas. And in fine, it is putting at risk our sectors and the sustainability of our sectors. So those trade tensions are extremely negative, mainly because the agri sector is normally taken as a hostage of completely unrelated disputes. I put the example with the US in the past on the Airbus and Boeing case, and in China, I will leave the floor to Jukka, who is suffering it. So yes, disputes, international disputes, are affecting certainty of our business, are affecting the way we trade, and in fine, are affecting our long-term sustainability.
Thank you. Jukka, if you want to share your perspective.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I would completely echo what Ignacio just said, and just add that, yeah, certainly geopolitics at the moment is one of our biggest preoccupations. I mean, you are aware of the various investigations and kind of looming trade wars that could hit the various European agricultural food sectors. So of course we are very worried about those. We also understand that it's not an easy equation for the public authorities to you know make the threat go away. But yeah, we'll see what happens. And if I may, I would just briefly add something to a previous question on food waste, because I think that's really something, at least in our sector, trade is all about keeping waste in the supply chain to a minimum. I mean, of course, as was mentioned, in Europe we have a big problem with food waste at the household consumption level, but the supply chains have been kind of driven to really a maximum level of efficiency, and I would dare to say that there is very little that gets wasted, because trade really ensures that all the kind of products and components find a home. And we even use in the dairy sector, kind of taking the example of cheese, product that is not for certain manufacturing deficiencies, not suitable for consumption as such, it's then melted and used as processed cheese, etc. So it's really being avoided.
Thank you very much, Jukka. And then while we approach to the very end, let me ask to Flavio how the future will look like for the EU. I mean, EU Sustainable Agenda. So what you see in the future? I know that you have said that there is very much on the plate, something you can't share, but if you can give a very general idea of what we are going to see in the near future, that would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, sorry, I pushed the raise button instead of the audio, so obviously I'm going to reply whilst raising my hand at the same time. Thank you for the question. Well, I didn't say that I cannot share things because I mean, I don't have things which I cannot share. I don't know them myself. Because the future is uncertain and unpredictable, because we are turning a page in terms of Commission, and so you will see in the next days, in the next months, how the new Commission will present its policies. However, having said that, we're talking about sustainability, so we're talking about environmental and climate change challenges. So it's obvious to assume that these challenges will not go away anytime soon. They will stay with us for many, many years to come. It's a challenge for humankind. It's a challenge for agriculture and food security, because if we are not able to make agriculture production more sustainable, we will run into food security problem globally, not as the EU only. As EU, we have our own responsibility in the world, of course, to address these issues. How will we do that? We have two courses of action. We will have our own internal domestic policies. First and foremost, the common agricultural policy, which will have to be reviewed. We will see in the first 100 days of the new Commission, so probably by the beginning of the spring, the Commission has committed to come out with a vision paper, so a sort of communication setting the objectives of the future common agricultural policy, which certainly sustainability issues will feature very high on the agenda of this document. So that's from the domestic point of view. And from the international, more trade-related point of view, we have a number of challenges ahead of us. We will continue to make sure, or try to make sure, that trade and sustainability keep on being consistent with each other, so that they are mutually reinforcing each other in terms of policies, and at the same time contributing by making sure that trade is also an engine of growth for the agricultural sector, so that not only the environmental sustainability but also economic sustainability is maintained. These issues will not go away. They will take the form, of course, of ratification of the current agreements. They will take the form of negotiation of new agreements, and they will take the form of our participation in again, in multilateral fora where we will continue to play an active role in terms of bringing our ideas on the table, trying to cooperate with other countries, and making sure that these common challenges will be addressed also in a cooperative way. So I don't think that these lines will change; they will stay, and we will see more of that in the months to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's clearly a lot. We're gonna see what's going on next. But as for now, I think it's really time to thank everyone. Before I do so, just let me remind for those of you that have noted, for those that have not noted, I'm going to tell you this. Now we're going to have another very important webinar on December 9. The webinar is going to be on critical dependency and strategic autonomy in the EU fertilizer market. Again, with the Commission, so the DG again. Again, IFPRI, USDA, and other speakers, Fertilizers Europe, FAO. So we wait for you to attend the other webinar. As for this, let me thank you very much, Ignacio Recarte, Yuka Liquitalo, Susan Stone, Rob Voss, and Flavio Caturni for the terrific panel. And thank you, Alessia, for moderating this. And thank you all the attendees for being with us. So I think it's time to close, and I'll see you next time for an FSR webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
See you.